Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jane Kamensky, the Pforzheimer Foundation Director of the Schlesinger Library at Harvard Radcliffe Institute. And on behalf of all my colleagues, it's such a pleasure to welcome Professor Katherine Katie Turk today, which happens to be the publication date for her important second book, The Women of Now. Turk is a historian of women, labor, and social movements in the United States. She works at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, where she is Associate Professor of History and Adjunct Associate Professor of Women's and Gender Studies. Her first book, Equality on Trial, Gender and Rights in the Modern American Workplace, won multiple prizes and set the stage for the enlarged canvas of her second, the work she's going to share with us this afternoon. Turk has also received numerous prizes for her teaching, along with nationally competitive fellowships to support her research, including in 2018-19, the Mary Ingram Bunting Fellowship at Radcliffe Institute. She spent much of that fellowship year working with 4 undergraduate Radcliffe research partners in the Schlesinger Library, combing the voluminous records of the National Organization for Women and allied collections of personal papers. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cartons of material. It was not Katie's first rodeo. She had been a regular Schlesinger Library customer since writing her undergraduate senior thesis. So she was up to the daunting task of sorting through a vast tangle of material, documenting the chaos and the purposefulness of a social movement to distill unheard signals and stories in all the noise. That is precisely what she's done in The Women of Now, which is sure to be the authoritative account of one of the most important organizations driving one of the longest lived and still unfinished American revolutions, the fight for women's equality. Focusing her sprawling canvas of a story on 3 very different main characters, Turk paints a picture of an organization that was much more diverse, more revolutionary, and more successful than it's often given credit for being. After Turk talks about her research and shares some of her findings and the rich, accessible prose of her pages, she'll be joined in conversation by my beloved and brilliant colleague, Durba Mitra, who is Richard B. Wolff Associate Professor of Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality here at Harvard. Fast on the heels of her prize-winning first book, Indian Sex Life, Sexuality, and the Colonial Origins of Modern Social Thought, which was published in 2020, Mitra is already nearing completion of a second major book, The Future That Was, which explores third world feminist thought and global feminist networks very much in the moment of Turk's Women of Now. So I know their conversation will be a real feast. Before I hand the virtual floor over to Katie Turk, let me take a moment to acknowledge the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and our annual donors who are watching this afternoon. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we thank you. We especially wish to recognize the Steiner Dean's Leadership Fund for Academic Ventures, which is supporting today's event. Let me also encourage those watching on Zoom to use the Q&A feature to submit your questions at any time during the program. The speakers will address as many as they can. Since we anticipate a lot of questions, we ask that you keep them short, which will enable the speakers to address as many as possible in the time we have. And with that, I will pass the virtual floor over to Professor Katherine Turk. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much to Professor Jane Kamensky, to my conversation partner and beloved feminist historian comrade, Durba Mitra, whose work is so inspiring and rich and generative. Thank you, Durba, for taking time away from wrapping up your own second book on similar themes and questions. I'd also like to start by just thanking so sincerely from the bottom of my heart the Radcliffe Institute, which has supported my work, and in particular this book project, in so many ways over many years. Quite simply, without Radcliffe's support, this book would not exist. And I know many in the audience are supporters of Radcliffe. And so I thank you sincerely for supporting my work. So I'll start today by reading for just a few minutes from the first couple of pages of chapter 1 of The Women of Now. And after a few minutes, I'll be delighted to welcome Durba Mitra to the floor for some brief questions. This is from chapter 1. We recognized the honest fire. At 10 o'clock in the evening, on June 29, 1966, about 20 women crowded into Betty Friedan's suite at the Washington Hilton Hotel. The room's elegance matched the mandate of the conference that brought them to the Capitol, the third annual gathering of state commissions on the status of women, as a place for ladies, not troublemakers. Returning to their hotel by chartered bus, after a boozy reception and buffet in the State Department's beautiful Thomas Jefferson room, the women passed through the lobby, which was decked out with plush furniture, pink globe lights, and Art Nouveau stained glass windows, and into one of 6 elevators. Once in Friedan's suite, they filled paper cups with liquor from Friedan's little bar. Some lit cigarettes and kicked off their shoes, some folding their legs beneath their smart skirt suits or stretching them out. It was a relief to unwind after a long, long day packed with meetings. Polly Murray surveyed the swelling gathering she had helped to plan. Murray was a seasoned 55-year-old organizer and attorney with deep roots in the civil rights and workers' movements. The descendant of enslaved women and men, Murray was raised in segregated North Carolina. She understood how inequities of race, class, and gender interlocked in people's lives. In her view, the flourishing civil rights movement needed women's energies, but gave priority to Black men's concerns. The labor movement privileged white women when it regarded their sex at all. Women's activism was segmented by race. Several decades earlier, white suffragists had marginalized Black women, then accepted narrowly framed voting rights that left Jim Crow limits intact. Murray was on a mission to link the struggles for gender equality and racial justice by centering Black women in both. She and her co-author had recently coined the term Jane Crow in an article for the George Washington Law Review, where they wrote about an analogy between racism and sexism in the law. But Murray was not content to keep her ideas on the pages of an academic journal. She waited somewhat impatiently for everyone to settle in. She felt the moment's urgency. After several minutes, Murray and Friedan told the group of their meeting's purpose: starting an independent national civil rights organization for women, as Murray later described it, that would have enough political power to compel government agencies to take seriously the problems of discrimination because of sex. Murray and most of the others had spent the past year debating how to end officials' foot dragging, and they were ready for action. Those East Coast lawyers and government workers in the room had seen women's rights become a common joke among powerful men in Washington. Fearful that outspoken activism would jeopardize their own careers, they believed that Friedan, by then a minor celebrity for publishing The Feminine Mystique 3 years earlier, had the independence and notoriety to become the public face of a strong new organization. Such a group was needed, they explained, because the landscape of women's activism, while robust, was diffuse. There were women's groups dedicated to myriad causes. Women were also active in political parties, labor unions, and civil rights, anti-war, and consumer groups. A new pressure group could unite them and focus their power. Murray and her collaborators were surprised to be met with ambivalence. The Wisconsin labor leader, Katherine Conroy, was among those who listened with skepticism. At 47, she was nearly a decade younger than Murray, but she too had spent many years inside male-led movements. Conroy was, quote, built square, said a friend, wore no makeup, and dressed like a dowdy elementary school teacher, with no pearls for sure. The daughter of a Milwaukee antiques dealer who was ruined in the Great Depression, Conroy found a job after high school as a telephone operator. It was hard work for low pay, and she saw how the bosses exploited women through stereotypes about their docility. She took a post in her union, the Communications Workers of America, where her brothers put their own needs first. But Conroy and the other members of Wisconsin's Commission on the Status of Women were working well with state lawmakers. Why should women jeopardize good relationships with government officials? Wouldn't another association simply stretch their efforts thinner? Murray tried to keep order, explaining the plan she had outlined on her yellow legal pad, but the tensions escalated. The Wisconsinites became frustrated that the gathering they had believed was purely social seemed to have an unspoken agenda. Those from the East Coast in the room were treating their questions as though they were not, quote, worth considering. As the Wisconsinites surmised, the meeting's planners, including Murray and Friedan, had already decided, after months of strategizing, that a new organization was desperately needed. After a few more minutes of debate, the room erupted into chaos. Eventually, Friedan, overcome with resentment, locked herself in the bathroom. The meeting was over, she claimed. Their proposed civil rights group for women seemed to collapse before they had finished drawing its blueprint. But of course, we know that not only did NOW not collapse before it was founded, it was established the following day and went on to become one of the most important advocates for women's rights, one of the largest, most prominent, and most expansive that the United States has ever seen. So with that, I'd like to invite my colleague Durba Mitra into our conversation, and we can have some back and forth.
Thank you so much, Katie. And I just want to say thank you so much for reading and for everyone for attending today. I want to congratulate you on an extraordinary book on the history of NOW, which is beautifully told through the life worlds of women who came together and found possibility. And thank you especially for reading that excerpt from the book, which comes out today. I laughed out loud the first time I read the story that you tell. And then I was moved by the stories that follow that story in the book. But this excerpt resonated so much with me, and especially because you read about Betty Friedan in all of these different settings in all over the world, from Iran and Mexico City and Nairobi to this, and the idea of her hiding in the bathroom, hoping that the meeting will end, is like, how many of us have felt that in feminist spaces? Like, let's be clear. But it also kind of gets at this, the energy of difference and sometimes struggle and debate that's part of feminist work, and the fear of a failure, and then the beauty of potential, which I think your book gets at so beautifully. So let me begin our conversation by first reminding audience members to please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to ask Katie questions about her book. So let me ask, I'm going to open our conversation by asking you to tell us, why did you decide to write a book about NOW? And how does one make a book about a national organization interesting history?
Thank you. I think the question driving this book really came out of my life, and it came out of my life quite early on. Growing up in the Chicago suburbs, my mother was an attorney who'd had lots of opportunities that her own mother, who was a sort of frustrated housewife and young mother of kids in the 1950s. And, she would have been on Wall Street, I think, if she'd had the chance. She had a real mind for business. And growing up, I wondered, how did so much possibility open, at least for the women in my family, over such a relatively short time? And got to college and was thinking about just the feminist scene in history in my town of Chicago, and came across wonderful records of the Chicago chapter of the National Organization for Women, which became the germ of my senior college thesis. And everything just kind of expanded from there. And as I read more about working women and their activism for my dissertation, I realized that I had a lot of questions about NOW, and that NOW was so important to women's struggles for workplace rights in the 1960s and 70s. And what I really wanted was a longer synthetic account of NOW to understand both where the workplace rights piece fit in, but also where NOW fit into a broader feminist landscape. But instead, I found that most of the scholarship on NOW did what I was doing in my own first book on Title VII and women's workplace rights, which was to slice off one piece of NOW's story by either looking at one chapter or one campaign or one moment, and extrapolating from that to tell, to sort of surmise what the broader story was. And so I decided that for my second book, I would
That's great. I mean, I think I love the ambition of the book, and I love that it is trying to tell a broader story, but you still choose to do so through the lives of women. In particular, the biographies, over the course of reading the book, we get to follow these women and to think about what is it that made them turn to now or create now and to build this possible future for themselves through an organization. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about thinking about the lives of women. How did you choose the people that animate the story of your book? And what kinds of decisions did you make in terms of the types of women that you decided to highlight in the project?
So once I decided to write this book, I did what any good or any eager historian would do. I went to the archive, which for now, there are now records spread out all over the country and some overseas as well. But the Schlesinger Library at Harvard is really the epicenter of now's records. So I went there and just started pulling up boxes and looking around, and very quickly realized that if I ever wanted to finish this book, and if I wanted to make the book a readable account that would be compelling and have a narrative arc, that I really wanted to ground it in women's lives. And that story, that choice also had to do with a kind of the linkage of the personal and the political that I saw in Now's records, and a kind of organizational history that just rooted in meeting minutes and newsletters and official documents of Now could tell a kind of story of the institution. And that kind of evidence grounds my story too, and it helps drive it forward. But it doesn't really explain what brought women and men to Now, and also what kept them there over longer stretches of time. Historians have written accounts of Now or pieces of Now's history that emphasize some of the fights and some of the major defections. And of course, there was a lot of conflict in a big organization that brought together a lot of different people and was doing a lot of different things and ambition to do much more. And people came and went as their lives changes and careers changed. But I was really interested in the longevity that the many of the women who found Now stay there, and many who join in the next generation also remain. And so I was interested in what Now meant to them over the changes in their life course, and how experiences in their personal lives, at home, at work, at school, convinced so many different women that they needed to work together through one organization, and kept them there for long periods of time. And then the activism in Now changes their lives. And so the book tries to capture this public and private dynamic, or personal and political dynamic, and really argues that there was not much of a separation between these two categories, which historians have often read onto women's politics in the past.
Yeah.
But I think, go ahead, Durba.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, what's interesting is following the lives of vastly different women,
yes,
who still find in the same organizational idea a dream or possibility, which I find really striking. And I think one of the things that Professor Kamensky says very beautifully when she was introducing the event was that we imagine the history of Now as this kind of middle of the road, mainstream project, but it's, of course, you tell a much more diverse history. And I wonder if we can reflect a little bit on that, which is about thinking about racism and racial difference in these political and social organizing efforts. Could you talk a little bit about those struggles about racism in building feminist movements and organizing? How did Now address issues of race? And how do you think Now either addressed or maybe wasn't able to address the needs and concerns, particularly of women of color in the organization?
Absolutely. So one thing the book really highlights is how many women of color were there at the beginning of Now, had the idea to form Now, women like Polly Murray and Dolly Lowther Robinson, who came out of the labor movement, understood the power of working together across difference, of building solidarity across differences of identity. But other African-American and Latino women were there from the beginning as well. And Now's history with race is often told as a kind of immediate downward arc, where once the organization comes together and starts affirming principles and making decisions, the women of color leave. And that is true, that many do. But I was interested in doing this research and realizing how many women of color stayed and continue to pursue their project of linking racial and economic justice to gender justice, and trying to convince or arguing to the white women in now that these struggles were linked, and that the specific concerns of women of color needed to be part of now, not as an auxiliary concern or a concern that's part of a laundry list of many, many issues, but right at the center. So now's efforts to, or the folks in now who advance that vision had relative levels of success or a lack of success over the years. It's certainly not a steady story or a static story. There were moments when, for example, one of the protagonists in the book, Eileen Hernandez, serves 2 years as now's president in the early 70s, but she sticks around for close to 10 more years, working to bring women of color into now and to convince the white women in now that they need to do more that's proactive to ensure that women of color want to be there. She leaves in 1979, but successive generations of women of color have come to now and pursued this project. And so, there are certainly moments in the book I talk about where some of the white women in now didn't understand why African-American women, for example, wanted to caucus on their own inside now. They wanted separate spaces inside now to talk about their own concerns, or why women of color and lesbians too, in some cases, wanted their own chapters of now within the same state or city or locality where there already was a now chapter. So there was some misunderstanding about what it meant to be in now and who deserved or needed separate spaces within now. So it's a story about missed opportunities, I think, but also the potential of now's vision, that its open-endedness, that it will stand for all women, provided an opening for women of all different walks of life to bring their concerns to the organization and demand real inclusion. And so the story of whether and how and when that happened is a story of ebb and flow.
Right. And I think one thing that comes out in the story that you tell so beautifully through these lives is also just how, like you said, people were demanding the idea of like a caucus on women of color within the organization. So there was a moment where the organization had the capacity or potential capacity to hold all of these different visions. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the tensions or differences. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit about the diverse perspectives of now members regarding specifically the Equal Rights Amendment, which we've been hearing often about recently, actually, again. How can we understand the perspectives of people who were part of now, who felt ambiguous about the ERA, who were worried that the ERA might lead paradoxically to the retraction of state legal protections for women as a class, and then the later push, or a more kind of cohesive push from now for the ERA that happens later in now's organizing?
So now one of many radical steps, I would argue radical steps that now takes right at the beginning. So it's founded in 1966. In 1967, the organization takes two pretty dramatic steps that are controversial even within now, and that is endorsing full abortion rights and endorsing the Equal Rights Amendment, which led to the defection of many women from labor unions whose unions did not support the ERA, but also Polly Murray and some of her colleagues of color who argued that not only was the 14th Amendment a better strategy because it was already in place, and as we've seen up to this day, trying to ratify the ERA is an ongoing project that remains a challenge. So perhaps Murray was onto something there, but that more flexible, more supple, a more flexible approach to equality might preserve some of the protections that were enshrined in state law without while granting women some substantive benefits too. So now endorses the ERA in 67, but up through the early 1970s, it is one of a long list of legal priorities that now endorses. So a number of priorities in the law that would make constitutional equality broadly beneficial to a wide range of women. And the ERA, it sails through both houses of Congress on a bipartisan fashion in the early 70s. And once again, now is working on many, many different priorities and projects, and the ERA is not its main concern. But as anti-feminists start to gain more traction, largely by arguing against now and presenting themselves as kind of now's mirror opposite, arguing that equal rights really won't help women, by the mid-70s, now is really at a crossroads. And the leaders of now make the decision to foreground the Equal Rights Amendment and enshrine it as the most important priority that the organization will pursue. And that decision had a lot of consequences for the organization in terms of its structure, in terms of its fundraising, in terms of the relationship between the chapters and the national organization. And the book shows how for especially for women of color and for lesbians, for whom, and working class women, for whom equal legal rights is one piece of their agenda, but it's not the only piece, and it's not the most important piece. That the late 70s, in a way, even as now is expanding, it represents a kind of contraction for now in the shrinking of its agenda to the focus on pursuing this constitutional amendment. So the story of now in the ERA is a complicated one. It's a story of now really being at the forefront of the movement that almost ratified the ERA and almost got it across the finish line. And of course, we would all be better off if we had it. But the book doesn't shy away from exploring some of the ambiguities and some of the implications of the choices to pursue an ERA first strategy. And the book argues that those choices resonate throughout the organization and continue to shape what the organization has become to this day.
I mean, I think it's really striking to read the debate about how we think about the category of equality, now, and how we see this I mean, we've seen it very, very recently, obviously, about the discussion about the 14th Amendment yet again in the affirmative action case. And so there's so much resonance with what you say in the book. And I wanted to point to one thing that you started to speak about in your comments, which were about the question of labor. One through line that I found striking in your book, and that I have found in my own research on third world feminist movements and transnational feminist coalition, is the intimate relationship between labor organizing and early organizational structures within women's movements. And of course, we're living now in a moment we see this revitalization of labor led by feminist, queer, and trans leaders who are thinking about questions of race, class, and gender politics very differently than they may have been 50 years ago. So you spoke a little bit about this, but I wonder if you'd elaborate more about the links to labor organizing, and also how now takes up the question of labor, and as you say, women's work, when you were talking about your own family history, as a model for organizations and alliance.
Mm-hmm. So the book makes the argument, perhaps somewhat implicitly, but it's there, that now would not have gotten started, let alone taken off to the extent that it did, let alone endured for decades and decades until this day, without the input and genius of labor union women right at the beginning. That many of the founders of now were veterans of labor struggles. They came out of the labor movement. They understood the importance of building structures that could endure and outlast any one generation of leaders or any one faction or fad within a movement. And so it was Wisconsin labor leader Katherine Conroy who insisted that everybody who signed up as a founder of Now put down their $5 to both to cement their commitment, but also to ensure that the organization would have even a modicum of funding to start to do its work. And as the founders of Now and then subsequent generations found out, doing that work was quite expensive. So one question that the book takes up, which is sort of a new question in relation to Now as far as the scholarship goes, is the question of work. Not just how Now fought for women's workplace rights and economic justice, but more broadly, who was going to do the work of the organization. And as Now got bigger and bigger, there was a ton of work. And the founders of Now, most of whom, by virtue of who was at that first founding conference in June 1966 at the State Commissions of Women, were mostly professional women, mostly middle-class women, middle-aged women who were not clerical workers, who didn't have special skills in that role or really much of a penchant for clerical work. And so the question for a feminist organization that was seeking to revalorize and lift up all different forms of women's work, argue that it should be better valued and better paid. How was this organization that had very little money going to contract out or take care of internally its own work. And as now continues, this question of volunteerism, women volunteering for the movement, becomes really challenging for now, because the organization cannot afford to pay people to do all of the mailing, all of the mimeographing, all of the all of the paperwork that was involved in the organization. And so the members who end up shouldering all of that work start to question, like, what is all of this work for? And what is it taking me away from in my own life or my own career?
Right.
So question of, go ahead, Durba.
Oh, no, I was just going to say it resonates so much. I think the question of the expansion of an organization, these feminist organizations, I see this so much in my archives as well, which is who's going to do the, it's an immense amount of labor. It's so much time. It's so much of a commitment. And to think about who does the labor of organizing, of course, we see that in labor movements, there are formal positions. In feminist, settings, the question of the technocratic nature of the work starts becoming more and more insignificant. And I think you animate that really beautifully through people's lives in the book. I wonder if we could turn to one thing that you mentioned in one of your responses, which was the ERA, reproductive rights. There was a whole plethora of things that NOW was interested in thinking about, because of course it was the National Organization for Women, and the possibilities were seemingly endless in the beginning of the 1970s. But of course now really starts to mobilize after 73, after Roe v. Wade. And so I wonder, again, today, now more than a year after Dobbs, how we can think about the history of NOW in relation to the last 50 years of reproductive rights and debates about reproductive rights.
Well, I would say NOW actually took off after mid 1970, August 26, 1970, the strike for women's equality.
Happening simultaneously.
Yeah, reproductive rights is part of NOW's broader agenda, and it's part of the agenda for that. It's one of the stated goals for that international protest. And I think, NOW did play a part, certainly, in the bringing about of Roe v. Wade. Local NOW chapters worked in their states to advocate for abortion law reform, and NOW signs amicus briefs for cases that then lead up to the case that becomes Roe v. Wade, which enshrines abortion rights, at least for a while, in the American Constitution. I think the lesson from NOW, one lesson we can take from NOW's history in relation to reproductive rights is how a multifaceted feminist strategy is the most effective one. So NOW had attorneys who were, fighting in court, pursuing not only reproductive rights, but many other causes. NOW's local chapters worked on reproductive rights, but in many different ways, right? So they're in the 80s, they're clinic escorts, they're sitting in at abortion clinics, so they're doing direct action, but they're also testifying at local hearings, they're writing letters to the editors of newspaper, they're spotlighting individual women's stories, they're pressuring state lawmakers. And I think this genius of NOW's multi-layer structure, where you have different kinds of structures of the organization working in tandem broadly toward the same goals, but in different ways, is one way to move forward now. That if the Supreme Court is not a route to if not regaining the protections of Roe, then to any kind of reproductive rights or freedoms, then what are the other avenues? And an organization like NOW was and is especially well suited to that, because it's so open-ended. Its members can pursue these big feminist goals in any way that resonates for them in their local communities.
Right. And I think that that's what's so striking about NOW is the infrastructure of it, right? It is just this massive organization that moves from the local to the national. And, as a writer myself, and I think many of our audience members are interested in that question, which is, NOW is this massive organization. It has local chapters, it has the national organization. How did you go about doing the research for this project? There are so many papers. I know from my project that doing work in the later part of the 20th century means you just are kind of bombarded with an excess of archives. So can you tell us a little bit about your research process?
Absolutely. Well, I mentioned my very first trip to the Schlesinger Library back in probably 2014 or 2013 for this project, and very quick realization that just pulling up NOW's finding aid the finding aid to only one of the Schlesinger Library collections of now, which is like 400 pages long, that working methodically through all of those sources was not going to yield a timely or coherent result. Really, what unlocked the structure of this book for me was choosing these three protagonists. And that sort of freed me from telling a kind of strict organizational history of now that starts in 1966 and perhaps comes up to the present and just looks at the organization from a top-down view. But instead, as we talked about, using these women's lives to kind of follow them in their homes, but then into their local chapters, and all three of them become leaders of now on the national level, and then they move on from now. So the book uses now and uses these women in now to tell a broader story about feminism. So once I adopted that structure, I didn't feel as bad anymore about not turning over every single page in the Schlesinger Library related to now. I spent a lot of time with the newsletters and newspapers, and spent a lot of time learning about these three women's chapters and local milieus. Again, the book is not an encyclopedic history of now, but it uses these three characters to tell a true story about now that uses the kind of telling details from their lives to give a portrait, a sort of general portrait of what now was like in all of these different eras. But it was very important to me to tell a history of now that was both personal, local, national, and even international. And so trying to keep my eye on all of those different balls required a lot of focused work in sources related to those different categories.
Yeah, I mean, I have seen the finding aids of just a couple of the collections at the Schlesinger. I mean, as you know, the Schlesinger Library collections are just extraordinary. And they're extraordinary in the best way, in that the catalogs and the indices tell us the types of materials that are in there. But having seen them, I thought to myself, my gosh, how do you write a history like this?
Well, can I tell you, when I got to Radcliffe in August of 2018 for my fellowship, our beautiful offices have these whiteboards, and I printed out maybe the index to that now MC 496 collection, and I just mapped it on my whiteboard and sat and thought, I will never get through all of this. This will never make sense to me. And I can say, by the time that we all left in May, I felt like I understood it and I had gotten through it. And there were big parts of the story, like the now Legal Defense Fund. I touch on it a little bit, but that would be a great history for someone else to write. And as we know, part of writing and engaging evidence is deciding which evidence you're going to leave for another scholar to really work with. And so that was a big part of the process too.
Right. And I think I have so much to say about what I think your book does. But I think what I love about your book is that it opens up the possibility of writing all of these different histories. Like, it is the foundation to think through the possibility of writing the history of now anew, which I think is just a beautiful thing. And I think it also tells us, what Audre Lorde told us about feminist solidarity, that our survivals are mutual. That's Lorde's language. And what's clear in your beautifully imagined history of now is that mutuality and solidarity was a dream of so many different kinds of people, and that dream fractured along many lines, and it was a complicated organization that resulted. And I wondered if you could just reflect very briefly for us about what you see as the shortcomings, the fracturing, some trajectories of failure that you've seen in the organization. And then we're going to open the questions up to the audience.
That's great. I love what you said before I get to your question about the dream of solidarity. And I think one inspiring lesson that we can take from this book is that when you look at the sources and the evidence about the women of now in the quote unquote second wave, it clears away the misconceptions and I think the partially true but also partially false notion that the second wave didn't accomplish everything it wanted to because the women just couldn't stop fighting, because they couldn't work across their differences, that elitism and racism and homophobia were so overpowering that we should understand that movement in terms of its failure. And of course, that's not true, that the project of building solidarity was incredibly challenging. What they were trying to do was really hard. I say that to my students sometimes. I mean, what they want, rolling back or trying to beat back hundreds and hundreds of years of white supremacy and patriarchy is a very difficult project. And the book spotlights the many different attempts that these women made to make progress and the kinds of progress that they did make. But certainly the book does not shy away from some of the shortcomings and the kinds of social hierarchies that are built into American society more broadly around race and sexuality and class. Many members brought those biases and the residue of those hierarchies into the organization. And we spoke a few minutes back about the Equal Rights Amendment. That's a perfect issue to think with. We think of this question: who will equal legal rights help the most, and for whom is that kind of a strategy that only focuses on equal legal rights, maybe necessary but not sufficient? We haven't spoken as much about sexuality and lesbians in the movement and again in the organization, and they, much like women of color, they fought a concerted struggle not only to have their specific concerns included or tacked on, but to put them in the center, and had kind of varying degrees of success with that project over time. So the book is a lot about now's potential and its ongoing potential. It's still here, but the ways that sometimes the leaders of now were not as attentive to the members and to the grassroots creativity of the organization as they could have been. And that at various moments in now's history, you see grassroots engagement and grassroots diversity sacrificed in pursuit of a kind of streamlined efficiency at the national level. And we can certainly understand why at various moments that kind of streamlined efficiency that many in now found that desirable, but the book shows that always came at a price.
Right. And I think that the willingness for you to sit in the tension and the paradox and the beauty of what that looks like, of the organization in all of its possibilities and limits, is what makes this book really beautiful. I'm going to turn to the audience Q&A. For the audience, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We have several questions in here. The first of which is, who are the three people? You keep mentioning protagonists. Who are the three protagonists?
We haven't named them yet. I can show you their pictures. I have them here in the book. They are Eileen Hernandez, about whom we spoke a little bit. She was of Jamaican heritage, labor organizer. There's so much more I could say about her. Civil rights activist who was working in California, rises to a role on the California Fair Employment Practices Commission, and in 1965 is tapped to be one of the first 5 commissioners on the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So she serves on the EEOC, and then she is now as national president from 1970 to 1971. And as I mentioned, she remains active in now until 1979. The second protagonist, Patricia Hill Burnett, who was many things. She was a portrait artist. She was a Republican. She was a beauty queen. She was Miss Michigan, 1943. And she reads The Feminine Mystique and joins the movement in middle age. So I think she's like around 50 years old when she founds the Michigan chapter of NOW and becomes really a feminist leader, a Republican feminist leader in her state. So you can imagine she had a much different perspective than Eileen Hernandez on how to build the movement and how to bring women together around which concerns, each had different ideas for the right concerns. And the third protagonist, Mary Jean Collins, who comes from a working class background in Wisconsin. She comes from a deeply Catholic family, was educated at Alverno College, the small women's college in Milwaukee, led by feminist nuns, several of whom were early forces behind NOW. And she moves to Chicago and in the late 60s, and is especially interested in focusing now on the labor question, but even more particularly using NOW to target the kind of the worst discriminators against women. And in particular, she leads NOW's campaign against Sears, Roebuck and Company. And
we have a follow-up question from that, which is, what made you choose these three people?
Well, I knew Mary Jean, and Mary Jean is still alive. I'm going to see her on Friday. I'm very excited. I knew the Chicago story. I knew from all the way back to undergrad. I think I mentioned before, my senior college thesis was about the Chicago chapter of NOW. And as a Midwesterner, I'm really interested in that history. And I think the NOW's Midwesternness sometimes gets overlooked in broad accounts of feminist history, because folks like Pauli Murray and Betty Friedan, both amazing figures who deserve all the attention that they get, sometimes stand in for what now was and where the action happened. And in fact, the Midwest was the driving center of now, I would argue, for much of its early history. So, and Mary Jean just illuminated a lot of the aspects of the story that I wanted to tell. She comes out as lesbian. In her 30s, she is a real builder. She's influenced by labor organizers and becomes a labor organizer herself. And I thought her story really cut against some of the misconceptions that we have about now. I'll be briefer in my justification for the other two. Eileen Hernandez was so important as a builder of now, and mentored by Pauli Murray. And I should say I chose these three women sort of on a macro level because each was mentored by one of Now's founders, but they were not founders themselves. So the book moves away from the founding of Now, actually, and gives the founders their due, but argues that if we really want to understand what Now accomplished and how it did it, we have to look to the next generation, many of whom, which members were in the organization for longer. They really put flesh on the bones of the structure that the founders created. So Eileen, an early leader, mentored by Pauli Murray, comes out of the labor movement tradition, but also as a federal official, she understands how government works. And I wanted to spotlight her work, bringing feminism and racial justice together, and her valiant efforts in that struggle. But the book also shows how those efforts didn't get as much traction as she hoped. And finally, Burnett, I like the idea of showcasing the political diversity in Now. From the very beginning, Now's founders are insistent that the organization be nonpartisan. As one of the founders famously said, neither party has a great track record when it comes to women. So we want to hold everybody's feet to the fire, and we'll make decisions about, Now doesn't make political endorsements until the 80s, but we'll make decisions about how we behave in the political arena based on which candidates from which party take which positions on our issues. So the story of the Republican Party in Michigan in those years is really interesting. And I liked the idea of focusing on somebody who was a little bit older, came from a different political background, different personal situation. She was married to a wealthy businessman and had a lot of, conflicted feelings about her role as a professional painter, but also as a mother. And she left behind these amazing journals, which are in the archive at the University of Michigan. And so those journals really helped me get into her psyche and understand where she was coming from. And I think her perspective, like Hernandez's and Collins's, represent many of the kinds of questions and aspirations that women brought to the movement and brought to Now. And sometimes those questions and aspirations aligned. They at least aligned enough that the women who worked through Now agreed that they needed to work together, even though they were so different, but they also diverged quite a bit. And so the book looks at, considers just how far can women who are very different diverge in their preferred tactics and strategies and points of view before they can't work together in the same organization anymore. They're just too different.
I love the idea that you were like, I'm not going to go with the founding story. This is not a founder story. This is a story about an organization that has found a way to sustain itself through multiple generations, and thinking about generational possibility and knowledge formation, I think, is a brilliant way to approach this history. There's many questions, which I also have, about how did you find information as people who are archivists and researchers? How did you find that story about Betty Friedan hiding in the bathroom? And I wonder if I can expand that question. Well, one, to ask that specific thing, but two, did you find any amazing magical documents that kind of shifted what you were doing? You talked just now about the journals, about those particular moments of archival discovery. I wonder if you might talk about both of those things.
Certainly. So the first question, can you re-ask the first question? It was,
where did you find the story of Betty Friedan hiding?
That's actually been published. There's a book called The Sisterhood that came out in the 90s that actually even included the detail that Betty was wearing a flowing cape, and the cape was the last thing anybody saw before she entered the bathroom and locked the door. And there are a couple of other foundational texts of primary sources about that night, what happened that night. I will say, I mean, Durba, you spoke earlier about the challenge of writing about this period, that there's just there's often so much evidence. There are so many sources. There are many, many accounts of what happened that at that conference of the State Commissions on the Status of Women, many oral histories, many written accounts. And so one of the challenges for the historian when there is so much detail is to sift through and try to understand, who's coming from what perspective. And, if somebody said there were 20 people at the meeting and someone else said 18 and someone else said 24, well, how do you accurately represent who was there, while also acknowledging that people have different memories and, nobody was standing up there counting. So we don't have an exact recording of how many folks were there, but to give a clear sense of what went down. But the short answer to that question is that was actually in published sources. The story of Betty, and then some oral history is sort of filled in the details.
And I wonder if you could just actually talk about that. A great question from the audience was about did you interview people? And I would extend on, did you interview people, and how did you integrate interviews or conversations that you had with former NOW members or people who know the organization well with the archives that you were finding? And then my other question would be asked, like, what kind of sense of responsibility do you feel towards the people who you know and you've talked to about this organization that's alive and well?
Let me start. Can I start if it's okay, Durba? I'll start with the piece of your question that I didn't get to from before, moments of archival discovery. One document comes to mind about that really opened things up for me and shifted my perspective on what the project was and where it could go. And that is when I was working in Polly Murray's papers, also at the Schlesinger Library. There are a number of biographies of Murray that have come out in recent years, which is fabulous, and there should always be more. But in accounts of feminism in these years, but also in Murray's biography specifically, the moment when she leaves NOW in 1967 over this question of whether NOW should endorse the Equal Rights Amendment is often treated as a kind of signifier that women of color no longer saw NOW as a vehicle for their concerns or their visions of justice. And working through Murray's papers, I was shocked to find evidence that she actually comes back to NOW. She leaves NOW in 67, but by 1970, she's moved to Boston and she's an active member of the Boston chapter of NOW, working for the ERA. So, and she also stays in NOW until at least 1979. So that convinced me that I was on the right track in writing this project in such a way that didn't paper over the divisions and the fights and the defections, but also took seriously people's returns and their the flexibility in their outlooks and didn't treat the movement so rigidly. Can you repose those next two questions?
The next question I was just asking was about interviews. So you talk to people.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. I did. Fortunately for me, the Schlesinger Library holds a magnificent collection of oral history interviews called the Tully Crenshaw Project. And it contains dozens and dozens of interviews of mostly former NOW members, maybe still current NOW members from this time. And so I did interview several dozen folks, but I really benefited from the existence of not only the Tully Crenshaw interviews, but many other interviews in archives all over the country. And, I mentioned before that I sort of knew the Midwest story before I started this book. And I'd made a real effort to tell that story and tell it in a true way, but also to dismantle whatever biases I brought to the project that leaned on that story more than the others. So it was very important to me to find interviews and archival sources from people who disagreed with the Chicagoans, who explained why they were doing what they were doing when perhaps I brought some skepticism to their view of the movement. So the book tries to paint a panoramic view of all the different possibilities and expectations and aspirations that people brought to NOW. And there certainly were times when someone I interviewed, or even someone whose interview I read, would, if they're interviewed in the 1990s, that's at least a couple decades probably removed from the heyday of their activism, were documents that I found in the archive that were produced at the time contradicted or complicated something that someone told me in an interview. And I tried to be true to both perspectives. So when I was reflecting or including evidence from an interview, I might say, she recalled later, or she told me recently, but there were times when something I encountered in the interview just did not line up at all with what was in the archive. And as a historian, I felt that I needed to lean more on the archival evidence. And his memory is so powerful. Oral history is such a powerful tool. But as historians, we know that we can't, we need to flesh out broader stories with all the different kinds of evidence that are available.
I think that's great. And I think, there's so many good questions to ask. There are questions in the Q&A about what do I do with my archives from now? Fabulous question. Please go forward and make sure that those are preserved, because you can see how we as historians get to use those. I'm going to ask one last question, which is, how do you think that now made relationships with other organizations, whether it be something like the Black Panther Party, maybe the Young Lords, or to labor unions? And do you think that they made effective relationships with other organizations?
I would say, yeah, sometimes. I think even in the late 60s, you see women who are founding now and coming to now in those really early years, many of them come out of other organizations and they really want to work together in now. And it's important to them that now be led by women, especially after the first couple of years, and be independent of the oftentimes like male-led groups that they came from, or that they also knew in their communities. Now we spoke before about lost possibilities. Now certainly could have built broader coalitions with the National Welfare Rights Organization. That was sort of a moment that where those two organizations didn't link up, and now could have done a lot more on its welfare rights plank and welfare activism, and to work in partnership with that organization. And the ERA is actually another moment where now is briefly part of this national coalition, ERA America, that is pursuing the Equal Rights Amendment together. But now leaders say, we're putting in most of the resources here and a lot of the money. We could just do this ourselves and have more control over this campaign. So after the ERA expires in '82, there's a new push among NOW's leaders to build coalitions and to work in real partnership with civil rights and labor groups. And I think that continues, but it was always a question in NOW's history about independence and not wanting to be co-opted and wanting to build a space that could be for women, and just how complicated that is.
Well, thank you so much. I thank you to all of these fabulous questions from the audience. This concludes our program today. I want to say thank you so much to Professor Katherine Turk for her excellent reading and conversation today, for our audience for their terrific questions. Today's program has been recorded. It will be posted on the Radcliffe website in about a week. For information about upcoming Radcliffe programs and to see videos of past events, please visit radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today, and please take care.